In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus repletuorum corda fidelium et tui amoris in eis signum accende. Dimite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione locuisti, da nobis in iodem Spiritu recta sapere, et de eius semper consolatione gaudere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. We'll see if we get to a full hour of class. If I don't fall over before then. If I do, just edit the footage, make it look like it didn't happen. No, but seriously, I may have to stop early. Anyway, continuing on with the famous theses being nailed to the door of the Church of All Saints in Wittenberg. Something that would be interesting to look into, I've heard it before, but I've never read it anywhere, is that essentially the act of Martin Luther's act of pinning these theses on the door of the church is generally held up by Protestants as being essentially the first blows to the evil papacy, the first steps of the revolt. And this was an incredibly bold thing that he did. Well, I've heard, and I've not read it anywhere, it'd be interesting to look into, but that essentially his putting up these theses on the door of the church was basically just like putting up a notice on a bulletin board. That was actually a very common thing to do. Some say academic theses it was a very common thing to post on the door of the church. So I've heard, or I've not read that anywhere. But if true, then it would be a useful way to answer the essentially Protestant propaganda that Martin Luther was so bold when he did that. So we mentioned that they were posted on the church the day before, on the Vigil of All Saints, October 31st, 1517. So we're approaching the anniversary of that. Yes?
Do we know in canon law that that's the way that bulls were promulgated?
Yes, there are certain things where promulgating bulls, but of course this is not a matter of promulgating a law. This is just a matter of putting your theses out there. No, he was not promulgating anything, obviously. He didn't have that kind of authority. So, of course, the feast of the titular of the church, the titular feast of the church was All Saints. So many people were guaranteed to come the next day. So his theses would get wide popularity. He made sure of that. And in fact, not only by that means, but also to the other efforts that he made and the efforts of his friends, the printed theses were made known everywhere. So they spread them far and wide, or as far as they could. And the boldness and impudence of these assertions contributed to their popularity. So whether or not the actual act of nailing the theses to the door of the church was, or at the time was perceived as being a bold act, certainly what he said was seen as being very bold, for better or worse, was very bold and, in fact, impudent. They were soon being read throughout Germany, exciting surprise, general surprise, and even admiration among some at the monk's language. The number of those who sincerely applauded the theses, or at any rate approved of the greater part of their contents, was much greater than what has generally been believed. So that's what our author says, that it was actually quite popular, his perceived boldness and defiance against the authority of the church. Which it's certainly plausible, given, as we've seen, there was a general spirit of revolt against the church at the time. There was a great, or at least a great deal of malcontent. The more timid, so perhaps there were some who were inclined to follow him, but were timid to do it because they saw, well, this goes against the teaching of the church. They were pacified by an introductory explanation of the author, embodied in the paper containing the theses, which stated that the propositions did not determine anything definite, but that out of love and zeal for the ascertaining of the truth, a public disputation on these questions would be held by Luther at Wittenberg, and that those who were precluded from taking a personal part in the debate might state their objections in writing. So that was his cover story at the time was, I'm just putting these out there as sort of the basis of a debate, almost like putting forth the objections, like the way that an author will assert objections in his work in order to answer them. That seems to have been more or less what he that's what he said at the time in order to disseminate this without being getting into too much trouble in the moment. But if we examine the theses more closely and watch the behavior of their author after they were made public, our author says that there appears to be no doubt that they were considered by him as settled beforehand and not merely as tentative propositions. So basically, he lied in saying that. Many of them, from the theological point of view, go far beyond a mere opposition to the abuse of indulgences. Luther, stimulated by contradiction, so by spirit of revolution, of rebellion against the authority of the church, out of a desire to be defiant, had to some extent altered his previous views on the nature of indulgences and brought them more into touch with the fundamental principles of his erroneous theology. So we saw earlier that he was moving, even as early as his visit to Rome, he was moving away from good works, of course, indulgences being contained under that heading. But now he's beginning to, as generally happens, when your practice says one thing, the theory will follow soon after. A practical renunciation of the doctrine of indulgences, as it had been held up to that time, is to be found in the Theses, where Luther states that indulgences have no value in God's sight, but are merely to be regarded as the remission by the Church of the canonical punishment. So he says that in some of his theses, such as 5:20 and 21. It destroys, of course, that destroys the theological meaning of indulgences, for they had always been considered as a remission of the temporal punishment of sin, but as saying not only, should be not only. But as a remission which held good before the divine judgments. You don't have to look up this sentence. It seems a bit confusing. So in some of his other theses, Luther attacks the generally accepted teaching with regard to the church's treasury of grace on which indulgences are based. We talked about that before, what that entails. Erroneous views concerning the state of purgation of the departed occur in some of the propositions. So he's denying purgatory now. Others appear to contain what is theologically incorrect and connected with his opinion regarding grace and the justification, but our author says that this opinion is not clearly set forth in the list of theses. And some of the other statements were merely irritating, insulting, cynical observations on indulgences in general, no distinction being made between what was good and what was perverted. Because obviously the practice of indulgences is an excellent thing in itself. The church should grant those and that people should take advantage of them. It's an excellent thing in itself. He didn't make any distinction between the good in itself, it's a good thing, and the abuses that had sprung up around it. So, for example, thesis number 66 declares the treasures of indulgences to be simply nets in which the wealth of mankind is caught. So yes, it's true that indulgences were being granted to those who gave money, but he essentially holds it up as being simply a means to catch people's wealth, to bleed them dry. Some of his other theses scoff and balk at the authority of the church, such as Thesis 86, in which he says, "Why does not the Pope build the Basilica of St. Peter with his own money, and not with that of the poverty-stricken faithful, seeing that he possesses today greater riches than the most wealthy Crassus?" Because apparently he imagines that the papacy has unlimited resources and can build any church, no matter the size, and do anything there do anything for which money is required. Apparently it's what he's imagining. The 95 Theses spread rapidly throughout Germany, adding dangerously to the already widespread dissatisfaction with the Church and the Pope. And then to Scultetus, who is the Bishop of Brandenburg, within whose jurisdiction Wittenberg lay, and to others also, Luther continued to explain the matter, as though the theses were merely intended to serve as the basis for a useful disputation, which, as a matter of fact, never took place. So he posted them saying, oh, this is just the basis of a disputation that he himself was going to ensure happened, and he never did. So a lack of sincerity there, definitely. He assured the chief pastor of Brandenburg of his absolute submission and his readiness to follow the Catholic Church in everything. And at the same time, however, he stated quite clearly that, in his opinion, nothing could be advanced against his theses either from sacred scripture, Catholic doctrine, or canon law, with the exception of the utterances of some few canonists who spoke without proofs, and of some of the scholastic doctors who cherished similar views, but who also were unable to demonstrate anything. But then he says, oh, of course, it's not for me to give any decision, but surely, but he essentially held himself up as being surely permitted to open a discussion by means of this disputation, which never took place. So he's saying ridiculous things here, obviously. It is definitely contrary to the teaching of the church. And then relying on his skill at debating, he was, as everybody's seen, he had a certain gift for rhetoric, even if it was full of invective. He was definitely a powerful speaker. Luther looked forward to a victory over Tetzel and to an opening for commencing the struggle against the abuses connected with the preaching of the indulgence. And here the words of his pupil Oldekop are reply. He spoke in unmeasured terms against it, meaning the preaching of indulgences, with great impetuosity and audacity. He started the controversy by nature proud and audacious. So it was very much in his nature to be defiant like this, according to someone who was his own pupil. And carried away by the astounding and ever-growing applause of those who were otherwise loyal to the church and deaf to the warnings and admonitions given him, Luther launched among the people a German work entitled A Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, which contained more statements which were yet more vehement and seditious. Almost at the same time, and with considerable haste, he put on the paper the weighty resolutions on his theses, written in Latin for the benefit of the more learned. The latter appeared in print in the spring of 1518. So he published also these resolutions which presented his theses in a more scholarly way, whereas the first one was, as we've seen, was a way to get attention. Among other things, obviously he did mean what he was saying, but it showed that they were spread abroad in a way that they were easy to understand. This was a little more specialized. And at the beginning of 1518, the Archbishop of Mayence had forwarded to Rome an account of the movement which had been started and of the monks' theses. As a result of this step, Pope Leo X, and again, let's not lose sight of the fact that we are covering all of this under the heading of Pope Leo X, instructed Gabriele della Volta, who was vicar to the general of the Augustinians, to seek to turn Luther aside from his erroneous views by letter and by the admonitions of honest and learned men, because delay might fan the spark into a flame which might be impossible to extinguish. So we see Leo X is taking some actions against it, but Luther's his revolution will continue. And then, so at the chapter of the Augustinians at the city of Heidelberg, which was held towards the end of April, the election of a new vicar general of the congregation to which Luther belonged had taken place. A new rural vicar had also to be elected in place of Luther, as the latter had now completed his term of office. So he served his term in that position that we saw before that he complained he was so overworked in. It seems that Staupitz and the large party who favored Luther wished to act as gently as possible and not to interfere in the movement beyond making the necessary change in the person of the rural vicar. So people who are on his side are trying not to make too many waves at this point. After Luther had received the summons to Heidelberg, to the chapter, the elector wrote to Staupitz a letter dated Friday in Easter week with a request to see that Luther, on account of his lectures, shall return here at the very earliest and not be delayed or detained. Though our author says that we cannot infer from this or from the elector's letter of safe conduct for Luther himself that measures against him were anticipated at the chapter. So it looks like he's trying to be protected by him, but the author says that it's not conclusive. These documents prove the exceptional favor which Luther enjoyed with the reigning prince. So he's definitely ingratiating himself with these rulers. Then, upon his return to Wittenberg, he devoted himself to finishing the resolutions on the indulgence theses. And on August 21st, he sent a printed copy to fellow named Spalatin. These Latin resolutions, which dealt exclusively with the defense of the 95 Theses, were more hostile in tone towards the whole system of indulgences than any of his previous utterances. They show Luther's fiery temper and his state of irritation even more plainly than the Theses themselves. So perhaps they were meant for a more educated audience, but they were no less polemic. In them, his new teaching on faith and grace was for the first time launched on the public in unmistakable outline. Even abroad, the learned were drawn into the movement by the Latin publication, which brought the matter within their range. So even learned people are taken in by his novelties. And together with his resolutions, Luther published 2 letters, which were very submissive in tone, addressed, one to the Bishop of Brandenburg, as the Ordinary of Wittenberg, and the other to Pope Leo X. To the Pope he said that he had ventured to address himself to him because he had learned that some persons at Rome were attempting to blacken his reputation, as though he were infringing the power of the keys of the successor of St. Peter. So he's not going to play the part of a victim. He explained the reason of the controversy from his own point of view and declared, "I cannot recant." Obviously, you can recant a heresy. In the same letter, however, he asserts his readiness to listen to Leo's voice as to the voice of Christ, who presides in him and speaks through him. There's only one thing he asks, namely, that the Pope will deal with him just as he pleases. He says, "Enliven me, kill me, call me back, confirm me, reject me, just as it pleases you." So, at this point, still very vehement in his expression of submission to the Pope. But again, he's sending these submissive letters at the same time that he's publishing these defiant resolutions. Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry. When you said it, chapter summoned him.
Yes.
Did he ever actually, he never actually came to the chapter?
No, he was there.
He was.
Yes. So in the resolutions, he said, "It makes no impression on me what pleases or does not please the Pope. He is a man like other men. There have been many popes in whom not only errors and vices, but even enormities," he used the word monstra, were pleasing. "I attend to the Pope as Pope," meaning as he speaks in the laws of the Church, or when he decides in accordance with them, or with a council, but not when he speaks out of his own head. So, speaking out of both sides of his mouth here. On the one hand, pretending to be submissive, but on the other hand, saying all these terrible things about the Pope in his resolutions. Let's see. Okay, so at a later date, he did not make any secret of the weakness of so ambiguous a position. On one occasion, in later years, when looking back on the commencement of the struggle, he said he had begun the controversy as an unreflecting and stupid papist. That's what he said. And that he had been drawn into the business by his own foolishness, that his weakness and inconsequence had been deplorably exhibited, seeing that he then still worshipped the Pope. Before this Lord of heaven and earth, he writes, everything still trembled, and he, the little monk, more like a corpse than a man, had only dared to advance with lamentable uncertainty and fear. So essentially he looks back on his submission, perhaps a feigned submission, but he denounces himself for having done even that, for having expressed any submission to the Pope whatsoever. So while Luther was superintending the printing of the resolutions at Wittenberg, he was at the same time engaged in other works. And now we'll enter onto the scene this fellow Johann Eck. This particular man had replied to his indulgence theses by the so-called Obelici, which Luther met with the Asterici and as Tetzel, so there's names of documents that they were using to attack each other. And as Tetzel, for his part, had issued a refutation of the Sermon on Indulgence and Grace, Luther brought out a work in reply entitled Freedom of the Sermon on Indulgence and Grace. So they're going back and forth. They would eventually just debate each other, but at this point they're doing it in writing. Fearing that the Pope would excommunicate him, Luther preached a sermon to the inhabitants of Wittenberg in the early summer of 1518, possibly the date being May 16th, on the power of excommunication. What he there put forth excited widespread comment and irritation. The sermon he issued in print in August, but in an amended form. In it, he says that excommunication is invalid in the case of one who honestly asserts the truth. Nevertheless, it must be obeyed. He blames the all too frequent use of excommunication, as many good churchmen had done before him, so he says. It had been recognized and taught from patristic times, his ideas, that an unjust excommunication did not deprive the excommunicate of a part in the inward life of the church. Actually, it is true that someone who is excommunicated but is innocent of the crime for which he was excommunicated is still a member of the soul of the church, but he does have to observe the excommunication outwardly. So something that SSPX should keep in mind. For a long time, they disregarded their excommunication by the Novus Ordo on the grounds that it was unjust. The Pope can't do that. Because the Pope is apparently, in their minds, incapable of interpreting his own laws when they apply and when they don't. So that was his idea. It is true but again, it is true that someone who's excommunicated but innocent still remains a member, say, of the soul of the church. So, is anyone here taking the ecclesia? You're the only one. All right. Well, you'll see that in more detail in De Ecclesia, but that is true. But again, to say that it's invalid in the case of one who honestly asserts the truth, that person would still have to observe the excommunication. Yes.
Was he excommunicated?
Not yet, no. Okay. But he was afraid that he was going to be, so he starts saying all these things in anticipation of possibly being excommunicated. So when he is excommunicated, he can just point to it, say, "Oh, I said this before. I'm not just making this up in the moment." But in fact, he was doing it preemptively with the view in mind that he might be excommunicated. So Luther emphasizes for his own party purposes, but without as yet setting up a new view on the nature of the church. This Luther emphasizes. Then in March 1518, complaints had been carried to Rome by some Dominicans, so his enemies. Towards the middle of June, fresh official steps were taken by Rome against Luther's person, this time without the intervention of the order. The course of these, I have to look at which order that is. The course of these proceedings has been made plain by recent research. The papal procurator fiscal, Mario de Perusco, raised a formal charge against the monk on the suspicion of spreading heresy. So he's caught the attention of the Pope by now. Of course, even he had written those letters earlier, but now the Pope is actually taking action against him through these other people. So by order of the Pope, the preliminary examination was conducted by the Bishop of Ascoli, Girolamo Ginucci, while Sylvester Mazzolini of Prierio, that's the Prierias that we talked about before, he was called that because that was the place he was from, who, like all mayors of the Apostolic Palace, something got cut off here. It doesn't say what he did like all the mayors of the Apostolic Palace. I got lost somewhere. But in any case, he had already made a study of the indulgence theses, which he, as he himself says, took only 3 days to draw up the opinion, which moreover he does not intend to stand as an actual theological refutation. So he printed the work In Presumptuosas Lutheri Conclusiones de Potestate Papae Dialogus. So essentially just saying he's writing against these presumptuous conclusions of Luther concerning the power of the Pope. Our author says that the work was not free from exaggerations and gratuitous insults. Of course, that's always something you want to avoid when you're dealing with somebody like Martin Luther. He's going to pounce on that, or he could easily do that. He could easily pounce on that to portray himself as being the one who was persecuted. Now, at the beginning of July of 1518, Luther was summoned to appear within 60 days at Rome to stand his trial. Ginucci and Prierias sent to the summons to Cardinal Cajetan, who was then stopping at Augsburg, in order that he might forward it to the Wittenberg professor. Prierias' pamphlet accompanied it, and Luther received both together on August 7th. He said at a later date in his table talk, table talks refer to Luther's just things that he said in an informal setting, again, just around the table speaking with his friends or his followers, talking about things that he did. Other people wrote them down. So when you hear table talks, that's what that's referring to. So Luther said at a later date in his table talks, alluding to the work of the mayor of the Apostolic Palace, that the dispatch from Rome had stirred his blood to the utmost, as he had then realized that the matter was deadly earnest, since Rome was inexorable. So he's realizing he's getting in trouble for this. And rightly so. The very next day, with many contemptuous and disaffected remarks on the citation, so he's clearly not being very submissive here, although he sets about, in fact, inducing the elector to use his influence with the Holy See in order that judges might be appointed to try the case in Germany. So he's trying to stay on his home turf here. He doesn't want to go to Rome. He wants to try to be tried in Germany. That's what he's going to strive for, a trial in Germany. He hoped to thereby be spared the dreaded journey to Rome. So, of course, not only does he have bad memories of his first visit to Rome, but this time he's really in the hot seat. He's going to be on trial. And again, in Rome, away from any of his supporters. So he definitely doesn't want to do that. It was at that time that he published the sermon on excommunication we referred to above. So against Prierias, he defends the opinion that our Savior commanded what was impossible because we are always subject to concupiscence. That was another thing. And we haven't. I covered some of the development of Luther's doctrine. There's a lot actually, and one of the primary Catholic biographers on Luther, Hartmann Griesar, goes into tremendous detail. And what I've given you here is actually a condensed and simplified version of what he goes into. And there's a lot more besides that. So if you want to read it, you can find actually the work. It's a 6-volume work on Luther, the Martin Luther, His Life and Work. 6-volume work. You can find it on the internet. And so one of his other things that we haven't talked about, but one of Luther's assertions, as we see, because he couldn't control his own unchaste impulses, he had this idea that we are always subject to concupiscence and that the commandments are impossible to obey. So he's defending it. Prierias is attacking him for that. He's defending that idea. He says that the sons of God are forced to do what is good rather than left to perform it of their own accord. And for this reason, higher theology teaches that those actions are the best which Christ works in us without our cooperation, and those the worst which, according to the absolutely false teaching of Aristotle, see, you can see why he'd be against St. Thomas, we perform by our own so-called free will. So he's just denying free will altogether, saying that concupiscence is something you can't control. And if we do anything good, we're acting like robots. But other than that, we can't help but sin, essentially. On the following day, the receipt of the summons, on the day following the receipt of the summons, he set to work on a pamphlet in reply to the Dialogus of Prierias. So he's trying to respond to this attack on him, which appeared at the end of August. And of course, keeping in mind that Prierias was a Dominican and a Thomist, Luther displays the bitterest animosity against the Thomistic school, especially in this place, an animosity which was henceforth never to cease, and likewise summons his national feeling as a German to help him against the Italian. So there's a national rivalry here, national tension and animosity. There's, when I say, considering he's still a member of the Augustinian order, a certain rivalry among the orders, a certain, of course, his dislike of St. Thomas, his dislike of scholasticism in general. It's all feeding his venomous replies here. In his replies, Luther had referred his opponent to the resolutions to his indulgence theses, which were already in print. And Staupitz, in fact, forwarded to Rome the copy destined for the Pope. So, in his efforts to procure the appointment of judges to try his cause in Germany, Luther sought, through the elector, to make use of the mediation of the Emperor Maximilian. But the emperor, who was earnestly solicitous for the welfare of religion, and at the same time was anxious to secure the Pope's favor on behalf of the election of his grandson, Charles, as King of Rome, just aside there, so the emperor wrote to Pope Leo X on August 5th, 1518, from Augsburg, that out of love for the unity of faith, he would support any measures the Pope might take against Luther. So this elector likes Luther, but he doesn't want to get in trouble with the Pope either. So he's expressing his willingness to cooperate with proceedings against Luther. More severe proceedings against Luther were accordingly set on foot in Rome, even before the 60 days were over. So they started even before the actual trial, or the deadline that was given for his arrival. There were already other proceedings moving against him. These measures were outlined in the brief of August 23rd, 1518, which was sent to Cardinal Cajetan. In the course of September 1518, Luther received the citation to appear before Cardinal Cajetan at Augsburg, as had been agreed with the Elector Frederick. And then on August 25th, or already on August 25th, the general of the Augustinians had, in accordance with the earlier and more stringent instructions from Rome to Cajetan, forwarded an order to the Saxon provincial to seize Luther and keep him in custody. So they want to make sure that he doesn't run away from this trial. At the end of September, Luther set out for Augsburg, where he arrived with a recommendation from the elector and an imperial safe conduct on October 7th. So he had started on the journey with our author says, great inward tremors, and was a prey to the same violent agitation at Augsburg. At a later date, he attributes the evil thoughts which plagued him to the influence of a demon. So, blame the devil if you do something wrong. He seems from the first to have been determined to carry his cause with a high hand, as ostensibly as that of Jesus Christ himself. That was his idea. Because he thinks he's discovered the true gospel after a millennium and a half. He becomes more and more convinced of his mission from above, a persuasion which takes possession of him with considerable force. Then, when he finally is in Augsburg, Cardinal Cajetan demanded the withdrawal of two propositions which he had plainly taught and acknowledged as his. The first was his denial that the treasury of the merits of Christ and the saints was the foundation of indulgences. The second was the statement which appeared in the resolutions, that the sacraments of the Church owed their efficacy only to faith. These were points in which he had manifestly deviated from Catholic teaching, and in addition, matters of supreme doctrinal importance. As a professor of theology, Luther had bound himself to submit to the teaching authority of the Church, obviously. So, I'll continue here. His final answer to the papal legate was that he could not recant unless he were convinced that he had said something against Holy Scripture, the Fathers of the Church, papal definitions, or sound reason. So it should be easy for him to recant then. But after this followed his secret flight from Augsburg to Wittenberg. So he does run away. Staupitz, who had stood by him at Augsburg, dispensed him for the journey from any part of the rule which might have proved to his disadvantage, even from the wearing of the Augustinian habit. So he says that he can run away in a suit and tie, or whatever is the equivalent at the time, in order to avoid getting in trouble. So there are, I'd say, more edifying examples of things like that being done. Like there have been instances of popes having to dress as simple priests in order to escape from various threats. There was once even Pius IX. I think it was Pius IX. He had to hide himself somewhere or something. He had to escape, dressed as a simple priest. And these revolutionaries were trying to break in. And so they had, I think, a Monsignor pick up the newspaper and start reading it aloud, as if you were reading it to the Pope in the room, but he wasn't even there. I imagine for some reason the revolutionaries fell for that. But this is a few hundred years in the future. But it was the case of a pope escaping revolutionaries, not the case of a heretic running away from his trial. The superior Staupitz had again shown himself at Augsburg, a man of half measures who allowed his prejudice for Luther to outweigh the demands of the Church and of his order. So Luther must have really ingratiated himself with Staupitz, but both because of switching sides in the controversy within the order, and then apparently also he liked his novelties, his new doctrines. The duty of providing for his safety and furthering his cause devolved principally on the court chaplain, Spalatin, so we saw him before. Luther, in his letters to Spalatin, which duly reached the elector, either as they were written or in extract, wisely avoids any demands which could only have been prejudicial to his interests. On the contrary, he declares in well-chosen language, which was certain to please the elector, that he is ready to take up the pilgrim's staff, should it be necessary for the good of the cause. The verbal commentary on his letters was undertaken at court by his able clerical friend. So, and he's ingratiating himself with protectors here. In feverish haste, without awaiting the result of his first appeal, he published, November 28, 1518, a new appeal to a future general council. I think we've heard that before. At the time of Luther's advent on the scene, the prospect of a general council, owing to the dissensions among Christian powers, had retreated into the far distance. So that's convenient. I'll appeal to a future general council. It's not likely to happen at all. Of course, as if that were something acceptable, but it's not. Clearly, we've seen that excommunication being laid down as the penalty for anybody who would do that, above the authority of the Pope, supposedly above the authority of the Pope, appealing to a general council. So not only is he doing that which has been forbidden very strongly, but it's not even likely to happen anytime soon. So essentially, he's buying time here. Even though it had been possible for the bishops throughout the whole world to assemble, the meeting, according to ancient custom and regulations of canon law, would have taken place under the Pope's presidency. And that's the obvious answer to somebody who would say, oh, I appeal to the authority of a future council. Well, obviously only a pope, a council's authority derives from a pope. So you can't invoke a council over a pope. So the powerful forces within the fiery and vivacious bunk seethed like the crater of a volcano. Vivid imagery there, courtesy of our author here. The lecture hall at Wittenberg again resounded with his eloquent and vehement outbursts. The number of students at the university increased to an unexpected extent. Luther declared in a letter that they surrounded my desk like busy ants. So he was popular among his students also. So he must have had a certain charisma if he was able to get so many people to protect him and become so popular among his students. He does not know whence the ideas he pours forth come to him, so he says, but he sees daily more clearly that they are from Christ. So he has this idea of that he's being divinely inspired to come up with essentially heresy. He wrote to Staupitz, his superior, I see that they are determined, meaning at Rome, to condemn me. But Christ on his part has resolved not to yield in me. So now he's setting himself up as being divinely inspired by Christ to defy the authority of the vicar of Christ on earth. Yes, that is contradictory. He says, may his holy and blessed will be done, yea, may it be done. Pray for me. So ridiculous what he's saying here. In the same way, though in stronger terms, he informs his friend Johann Lang soon afterwards, our Eck is again, so Johann Eck, we talked about earlier, is again preparing to assail me. It will come to this, that with the help of Christ, I shall carry out what I have long since planned, namely, to strike a deadly blow at the Roman vipers by means of a powerful book. Hitherto I have merely played and jested with Rome, albeit she has smarted as keenly under it as though it had been meant in deadly earnest. So it's saying, oh, up until now I've gone easy on them, but even that has caused them serious damage. So clearly he's got a high opinion of his abilities here. Now, not to mention his ridiculous ideas that he's divinely inspired to defy the authority of the church. Ridiculous. Even blasphemous. So he said, after that, soon afterwards he says, so God carries me away, God draws me, I cannot control myself. Ridiculous. That's what he's saying. God must see to it what he is working through me. Why has he not instructed me otherwise? He fancies he feels the mighty breathing of the Spirit, and little by little he is carried away by the conviction that he is God's messenger and the leader of a cause which is not of man's invention. More of the same. Now we move on to an event in June 1519 called the Leipzig Disputation, which is also the origin and theological course of which has often been depicted, as was expected, merely induced Luther to proceed yet further with his revolutionary theology. So this disputation at Leipzig pushed him further along the path he was already going down. The Pleissenberg building, yes.
Oh, how do you spell Leipzig?
Leipzig. Leipzig. So the Pleissenberg, that's the name of a building of Leipzig, has become, since the disputation between Luther and Karlstadt on the one side and Eck on the other, a memorable monument of German history. That is a remark by our author that I'm not sure. I have the impression when I looked this up earlier, that that building may not be there anymore, but it certainly was for a long time a monument, became something of a monument because of the debate, this disputation which took place there. The great hall of this castle belonged to Duke George and was hung with tapestries, and a guard of citizens kept watch before the walls of the castle. Because the court and the whole city wished to ensure the safety of those conducting the tournament within, which was to be held in the public name. So this is a big deal. They're ramping up the security, as we'd say today, for this thing. In addition to the professors of the University of Leipzig and the guests from Wittenberg, students as well as masters, many others were present, brought together partly by curiosity, partly by interest in one or another of the religious parties. The Duke, the guests of distinction, and the sworn stenographers had special places assigned to them. So I'm just going on here a bit about the setup of it. Two professorial chairs stood facing each other. On that belonging to the Wittenberg party, Karlstadt, who had arranged the affair, took his seat and disputed with Eck for 4 whole days on man's free will and its efficacy with and under grace. So this is longer than, say, presidential debates. It's going on for days here. Yes? Who's it, Karlstadt or Eck?
Yes.
Eck. E-C-K. And that's also Karlstadt. So stage is set here. Actually, what I think we'll do is we'll stop here today so that we can, having set the stage, we can return to this on, I suppose Monday's our next class. We can return to this later, see what happens at this disputation. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum residium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationes in despicias, in necessitatibus rapericulis cunctis libera nos semper virgo gloriosa et benedicta. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.